Chapter 4. Orange is the New Black. The next morning, I and 8 other new arrivals reported for a day-long orientation session, held in the smallest of the TV rooms. Among the group was one of my roommates, a Zoftig Dominican girl who was an odd combination of sulky and helpful. She had a little tattoo of a dancing Mephistopheles figure on her arm, with the letters J.C. I tentatively asked her if they stood for Jesus Christ, maybe protecting her from the festive devil. She looked at me as if I were completely insane, then rolled her eyes. "That's my boyfriend's initials." Sitting on my left against the wall was a young black woman to whom I took an instant liking for no reason. Her rough cornrows and aggressively set jaw couldn't disguise the fact that she was very young and pretty. I made small talk, asking her name, where she was from, how much time she had to do, the tiny set of questions that I thought were acceptable to ask. Her name was Janet, she was from Brooklyn, and she had 60 months. She seemed to think I was weird for talking to her. A small white woman on the other side of the room, on the other hand, was chatty. About 10 years my senior, with a friendly witch aspect, straggly red hair, aquiline nose, and weathered creases in her skin, she looked as if she lived in the mountains or by the sea. She was back in prison on a probation violation. "I did 2 years in West Virginia. It's like a big campus, decent food. This place is a dump." She said this all pretty cheerfully, and I was stunned that anyone returning to prison would be so matter-of-fact and upbeat. Another white woman in the group was also back in for a violation, and she was bitter, which made more sense to me. The rest of the group was a mixed bag of black and Latino women who leaned against the walls, staring at the ceiling or floor. We were all dressed alike, with those stupid canvas slippers. We were subjected to an excruciating 5-hour presentation from all of Danbury FCI's major departments: finance, phones, recreation, commissary, safety, education, psychiatry, an array of professional attention that somehow added up to an astonishingly low standard of living for prisoners. The speakers fell into 2 categories: apologetic or condescending. The apologetic variety included the prison psychiatrist, Dr. Kirk, who was about my age and handsome. He could have been one of my friend's husbands. Dr. Kirk sheepishly informed us that he was in the camp for a few hours each Thursday and couldn't really supply any mental health services unless it was an emergency. He was the only provider of psychiatric care for the 1,400 women in the Danbury complex, and his primary function was to dole out psych meds. If you wanted to be sedated, Dr. Kirk was your guy. In the condescending category was Mr. Scott, a cocky young corrections officer who insisted on playing a question-and-answer game with us about the most basic rules of interpersonal behavior and admonished us repeatedly not to be gay for the stay. But worst of all was the woman from Health Services, who was so unpleasant that I was taken aback. She firmly informed us that we had better not dare to waste their time, that they would determine whether we were sick or not and what was medically necessary, and that we should not expect any existing condition to be addressed unless it was life-threatening. I silently gave thanks that I was blessed with good health. We were fucked if we got sick. After the Health Services rep was out of the room, the red-headed violator piped up, "Jesus F. Christ, who peed in her Cheerios?" Next, a big bluff man from facilities with enormously bushy eyebrows entered the room. "Hello, ladies," he boomed. "My name is Mr. Richards. I just wanted to tell you all that I'm sorry you're here. I don't know what landed you here, but whatever happened, I wish things were different. I know that may not be much comfort to you right now, but I mean it. I know you've got families and kids and that you belong home with them. I hope your time here is short." After hours of being treated as ungrateful and deceitful children, this stranger showed us remarkable sensitivity. We all perked up a bit. "Kerman?" Another prisoner with a clipboard stuck her head into the room. "Uniforms!" I was lucky to arrive at prison on a Wednesday. Uniform issue was done on Thursdays, so if you self-surrendered on a Monday, you might be pretty smelly after a few days, depending on whether you sweat when you are nervous. I followed the clipboard down the hall to a small room where uniforms were distributed, leftovers from when the place had been a men's facility. I was given 4 pairs of elastic-waist khaki pants and 5 khaki polyblend button-down shirts, which bore the names of their former wearers on the front pockets. Maria Linda Malinado, Vicky Frazier, Marie Saunders, Carol Ryan, and Angel Chavasco. Also, 1 set of white thermal underwear, an itchy boiled wool hat, scarf, and mittens. 5 white t-shirts, 4 pairs of tube socks, 3 white sports bras, 10 pairs of granny panties, which I soon discovered would lose their elastic after a couple washings, and a nightgown so enormous it made me giggle. Everyone referred to it as a muumuu. Finally, the guard who was silently handing me the clothing asked, "What size shoe?" 9.5. He pushed a red and black shoebox toward me, containing my very own pair of heavy black steel-toed shoes. I hadn't been so happy to put on a pair of shoes since I found a pair of peep-toed Manolo Blahniks at a sample sale for $50. These beauties were solid and held the promise of strength. I loved them instantly. I handed back those canvas slippers with a huge smile on my face. Now I was a for-real hardened con. I felt infinitely better. I strutted back into orientation in my steel toes. My fellows were still there, their eyes rolling back into their heads from the endless droning. The nice man from facilities had been replaced by Torricella, the counselor who partnered with Butorsky and had allowed me to call Larry the night before. I came to think of him as Mumbles. His walrus-like visage rarely changed. I never heard him raise his voice, but it was difficult to read his mood, beyond mild aggravation. He informed us that Warden Kuma Debu would be gracing us with her presence momentarily. Suddenly I was interested. I knew nothing of the warden, the big boss who was a woman and one with an unusual name to boot. I had not heard a word about her in the 24 hours I had been in prison. Would she resemble Wendy O. Williams or Nurse Ratched? Neither. Warden Debu sailed into the room and took a seat facing us. She was only 10 years older than me, tops, and she was fit, olive-skinned, and good-looking, probably of Middle Eastern extraction. She was wearing a dowdy pantsuit and hideous costume jewelry. She spoke to us in an informal, faux-warm fashion that instantly reminded me of someone running for office. "Ladies, I am Warden Kuma Debu, and I am here to welcome you to Danbury, which I know is not an ideal scenario for any of you. While you are here, I am responsible for your well-being. I am responsible for your safety. I am responsible for you successfully completing your sentences. So, ladies, the buck stops here." She went on for a while in this vein, with some mention of personal responsibility, ours, thrown in, and then she got down to the sex part. "If anyone at this institution is pressuring you sexually, if anyone is threatening you or hurting you, I want you to come directly to me. I come to the camp every Thursday at lunch, so you can come up and talk to me about anything that is happening to you. We have a zero-tolerance policy for sexual misconduct here at Danbury." She was talking about prison guards, not marauding lesbians. Clearly, sex and power were inseparable behind prison walls. More than a few of my friends had voiced their fears that in prison I would be in more danger from the guards than the inmates. I looked around the room at my fellow prisoners. Some looked scared. Most looked indifferent. Warden Debu finished her spiel and left us. One of the other prisoners tentatively volunteered, "She seems nice." The bitter violator who had previously been locked up at Danbury snorted. "Miss Slick, don't expect to see her again, except for 15 minutes every other Thursday on the line. She talks a good game, but she might as well not be here. She don't run this place. That zero-tolerance shit? Just remember this, ladies. It's going to be your word against theirs. New arrivals in federal prison are stuck in a sort of purgatory for the first month or so, when they are A&Os, admissions and orientation status. When you are an A&O, you can't do anything. Can't have a job, can't go to GED classes, can't go to chow until everyone else does, can't say a word when ordered to shovel snow at odd hours of the night. The official line is that your medical tests and clearances must come back from whatever mysterious place they go before your prison life can really start. Nothing involving paperwork happens quickly in prison, except for lockups and solitary, and a prisoner has no way to get speedy resolution with a prison staffer of anything. There are a dizzying number of official and unofficial rules, schedules, and rituals. Learn them quickly or suffer the consequences, such as being thought an idiot, being called an idiot, getting on another prisoner's bad side, getting on a guard's bad side, getting on your counselor's bad side, being forced to clean the bathrooms, eating last in line when everything edible is gone, getting a shot or incident report put in your record, getting sent to the Special Housing Unit, or SHU, also known as Solitary, the Hole, or SAG. Yet the most common response to a query about anything other than an official rule is, "Honey, don't you know you don't ask questions in prison?" Everything else, the unofficial rules, you learn by observation, inference, or very cautious questioning of people you hope you can trust. Being an A&O that February, a leap year no less, was a strange combination of confusion and monotony. I prowled around the camp building, trapped not only by the feds but also by the weather. With no job, no money, no possessions, no phone privileges, I was verging on a non-person. Thank God for books and the gifts of paper and stamps from other prisoners. I couldn't wait for the weekend and the prospect of seeing Larry and my mother. Friday, there was snow. A worried-looking Annette woke me up by wiggling my foot. "Piper, they've been calling the A&Os for snow duty. Get up!" I sat up, confused. It was still dark. Where was I? "Kerman, Kerman! Report to the CO's office, Kerman!" the PA boomed. Annette was bug-eyed. "You have to go now. Get dressed." I tumbled into my new steel-toed shoes and presented myself at the correctional officer's office, totally disheveled and with unbrushed teeth. The CO on duty was a dykey blonde woman. She looked as if she ate new fish like me for breakfast after her triathlon workouts. "Kerman?" I nodded. "I called the A&Os a half hour ago. There's snow duty. Where were you?" I was asleep. She looked at me like I was a worm squirming on the sidewalk after spring rain. "Oh, yeah? Get your coat on and shovel." What about breakfast? I put on my thermal underwear and the ugly stadium coat with the broken zipper and headed out to meet my compadres in the whipping icy wind, clearing the walks. By now the sun had risen, and there was a gloomy half-light. There were not enough shovels for everyone to use, and the one I used was broken, but no one could go back inside until the work was done. We had more salt scatterers than shovelers. One of the A&Os was a little Dominican lady in her 70s who barely spoke a word of English. We gave her our scarves, wrapped her up, and put her out of the wind in a doorway. She was too scared to go inside, although it was insane for her to be out there in the cold with us. One of the other women told me over the wind that the old lady had a 4-year sentence for a wire charge, taking phone messages for her drug-dealing male relative. I wondered what U.S. attorney was enjoying that particular notch in his or her belt. I worried that the weather would prevent Larry from driving up from New York, but I had no way of knowing, so before visiting hours began at 3 p.m., I tried to pull myself together. Freshly showered and wearing the uniform that I thought was the least unflattering, I stood in the fluorescent light of the decrepit bathroom and looked at the unfamiliar woman in the mirror. I looked undecorated, and to my eye unfeminine. No jewelry, no makeup, no embellishments at all. Someone else's name was on the breast pocket of my khaki shirt. What would Larry think when he saw me now? I went to wait outside the big recreation room where visits were held. A red light was mounted on the wall of the visiting room. After a prisoner saw her people walk up the hill and into the camp building, or if she heard her name called over the PA system, she would flip a light switch by the side of the room's double doors, and a red light on the other side of the doors would go on too, alerting the visiting room CO that the prisoner was in place, waiting to see their visitor. When the CO felt like it, they would get up, go to the doors, pat down the inmate, and allow her into the visiting room. After an hour or so on the landing next to the visiting room, I began to wander the main hall, bored and nervous. When I heard my name called over the PA system, "Kerman, report to visitation," I race-walked up to the landing. A female guard with curly hair and bright blue eyeshadow was waiting for me on the landing. I spread my arms and legs, and she skimmed her fingertips along my extremities, under my collar, below my sports bra, and around my waistband. "Kerman, first time, right? Okay, he's in there waiting for you. Watch the contact." She pulled open the visiting room door. For visits, the large room was set up with card tables and folding chairs. When I arrived, they were about half filled, and Larry was sitting at one of them, looking anxious and expectant. When he saw me, he jumped to his feet. I walked as quickly as I could to him and threw my arms around him. I was so grateful that he looked happy. I felt like myself again. Hugging and kissing your visitors, no tongue, was permitted at the beginning and end of the visit. Some guards would allow hand-holding, some would not. If a guard was having a bad day, week, or life, we would all feel it in that bleak linoleum-floored visiting room. There were always 2 prisoners working in the visiting room, too, assisting the CO, and they were stuck making small talk with the guard for hours. Larry and I took our seats at the card table, and he just stared at me, smiling. I felt suddenly shy and wondered if he saw a difference in me. Then we started to talk, trying to cover an impossible amount of ground all at once. I told him what had happened after he left the prison lobby, and he told me what it had been like for him to have to leave. He said that he had talked to my parents, that they were holding up, and that my mother was coming to visit tomorrow. He listed all the people who had called to try to find out how I was, and who had sent in requests to be approved as visitors. I explained to him that there was a 25-person limit on my visitor list. Our friend Tim had set up a website, www.thepipebomb.com, and Larry was posting all the relevant information, including an FAQ, there. We talked for hours. Visiting hours were 3 to 8 p.m. on Fridays. And Larry was curious about every detail of prison so far. Together at the card table, I could relax the taut watchfulness and caution that had governed my every move for the last 3 days, and almost forget where I was, even as I shared every discovery that my new life offered. I felt so loved sitting there with him, and more confident that someday I would be able to leave this horrible place behind. I reassured Larry countless times that I was okay. I told him to look around. Did the other prisoners look so bad? He thought they did not. At 7:45, it was time for Larry and the other visitors to leave. My whole heart clutched up. I had to leave the bubble of love around our card table. I wouldn't see him for another week. "Did you get my letters?" he asked. "No, not yet. No mail. Everything here is on prison time. Slow motion." Departures were tough, and not just for us. A toddler didn't want to leave her mother and wailed as her father struggled to get her into her snowsuit. Visitors and prisoners shifted from one foot to another as they tried to say goodbye. We were all permitted a final hug, and then watched as our loved ones' backs disappeared into the night. The more experienced prisoners were already unlacing their shoes, getting ready for the strip search. This ritual, which I'd repeat hundreds of times in the next year, never varied. Remove shoes and socks, shirt, pants, t-shirt. Pull up your sports bra and display your breasts. Show the soles of your feet. Then turn your back to the female prison guard. Pull down your underpants and squat, exposing yourself. Finally, force a cough, which would, theoretically, cause any hidden contraband to clatter to the floor. I always found the interchange between the person who has no choice but to strip naked and the guard who gives the order to be brisk and businesslike. But some women found strip searches so humiliating that they would forego visits in order to avoid it. I would never have survived without my visits, and so would grit my teeth and rush through the motions. It was the prison system's quid pro quo. You want contact with the outside world? Be prepared to show your ass every time. With my clothes back on, I walked back out into the main hall, floating on air and memories of everything Larry had said. Someone said, "Hey, Kerman, they called your name at mail call." I headed straight to the CO's station, and he handed me 16 wonderful letters, including Larry's, and a half-dozen books. Somebody out there loved me. The next day, my mother was due to arrive. I could only guess at how awful the last 72 hours had been for her, and I worried what she would think when she saw that razor-wire fence. It evoked a primal fear. When they called my name on the PA, I could barely stand still for the pat-down. I flew through the doors of the visiting room, scanning for my mother's face. When I saw her, it was as if all our surroundings faded into a distant background. She burst into tears when she saw me. In 34 years, I couldn't remember her ever looking more relieved. I spent most of the next 2 hours trying to reassure Mom that I was okay, that no one was bothering me or hurting me, that my roommates were helping me, and that the guards were leaving me alone. The presence of other families in the visiting room, many with little kids, was a reminder to me that we were not the only ones. In fact, we were just one of millions of American families trying to cope with the prison system. My mother fell silent as she watched a little girl playing with her parents at another card table. The strain on her face wiped away any complaint or self-pity I might have had. She was putting on a brave front, but I knew she would cry all the way to the car. The hours I would spend in the prison visiting room were among the most comforting of my life. They sped by, the only occasion at the camp in which time seemed to move quickly. I could completely forget about the human stew that lay on the other side of the visiting room doors, and I carried that feeling with me for many hours after each visit was over. But I could see how awful and scary it was for my family to see me in my khaki uniform and get a tiny taste of what I was experiencing, surrounded by guards, strangers, and powerful systems of control. I felt terrible for exposing them to this world. Every week I needed to renew my promises to my mother and Larry that I was going to make it, that I was okay. I felt more guilt and shame witnessing their worry than when I stood in front of the judge, and it had been terrible standing in that courtroom. The camp had distinct rhythms of frenzied action and lulls of calm, like a high school or an ER ward. In bursts of activity, the polyglot of women came and went, clustered in groups, hurried, loitered, very often waited, and almost always chattered in an overwhelming rush of noise, accents, and emotions mixing into swirling eddies of language. Other times, the place was still and silent, sleepy during some hours of the day, when most of the campers were off at their job assignments, and the orderlies had already hustled through their cleaning assignments and gone off to nap, crochet, or play cards. At night, after 10 p.m. lights out, the halls were quiet, haunted by the occasional woman in her muumuu heading to the bathroom or the mail drop box, navigating by the distant light from a common room where someone was sitting, perhaps illicitly watching after-hours TV. My understanding of the causes of these patterns of movement, meals, mail call, work call, pill line, commissary days, phone time, was still tenuous. But I learned more every day, filing away the information and trying to figure out where I fit in. Letters and good books, an overwhelming number of good books, started to pour in from the outside world. At mail call almost every day, the gay porn star would bellow, "Kerman!" and shove a plastic bin overflowing with a dozen books toward me with his boot, half disgusted and half perplexed. The entire population of the camp would watch me claim my mail, with the occasional wisecrack, "You keeping up?" On the one hand, folks were impressed at this evidence that people on the outside cared about me. On the other hand, the literary avalanche was proof that I was different, a freak. "She's the one with the books." Annette and a few other women were delighted by the influx of new reading material and borrowed from my library with abandon and permission. Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, and Alice in Wonderland definitely served to fill the time and keep me company inside my head. But I was really lonely in my actual physical life. I was cautiously trying to make friends, but like everything else in prison, it was tricky. There were too many places where a newbie like me could easily misstep, like the chow hall. The chow hall was like a high school cafeteria, and who has fond memories of that? A vast linoleum room filled with tables with 4 attached swivel chairs. It was lined on 2 sides by windows that looked out toward the main back entrance to the camp, where there were parking spaces, a handicapped ramp, and a forlorn and unused basketball hoop. Breakfast was a quiet affair, attended by only a fraction of the prisoners, mostly the older ones who appreciated the almost meditative peace of the morning ritual at 6:30 a.m. There was never a wait at breakfast. You grabbed a tray and plastic cutlery and approached the kitchen line from which food was dished out by other prisoners, some blank-faced, some chatty. It could be cold cereal or oatmeal, or on a really good day, boiled eggs. Usually there was a piece of fruit for every person, an apple or banana, or sometimes a rock-hard peach. Big vats of watery coffee sat next to cold drink dispensers filled with water and something like weak Kool-Aid. I got in the habit of going to breakfast, where I would sit alone peacefully, not drinking the terrible coffee, observing the other prisoners come and go, and watching the sunrise through the east-facing windows. Lunch and dinner were altogether different. The line of women waiting for their food stretched the length of the wall below the windows and sometimes out the door, and the noise was tremendous. I found these meals nerve-wracking and would cautiously advance with my tray, darting my eyes around for someone I knew near an empty chair, or, even better, an empty table that I could grab. Sitting with someone you didn't know was a dicey proposition. You could be met with the hairy eyeball and a resounding silence, or a pointed, "This seat is saved." But you could also be met with a chatterer or a questioner. And when I ventured afield, I was often nabbed after the meal by Annette. "You want to stay away from that one, Piper. She'll be after you to buy her commissary in no time." Annette had a maternal instinct that was a force of nature and helped me navigate the official rules, like remembering the counts and the pack numbers and what day I was allowed to bring my clothes to the laundry to be washed. But she was leery of most other prisoners who were not middle class and white. It turned out that early on Annette had been gamed by a young girl who had gotten the older woman to buy her lots of commissary items, playing on her pity. The girl was in fact notorious for her hustles of new prisoners, so Annette felt burned, and her caution was outsize. Annette included me in endless Rummy 500 games with her set of Italians, who grudgingly tolerated my poor play. The black women played far more boisterous games of spades a few tables over. The Italians sniffed that they all cheated. Annette introduced me to Nina, a fellow Italian who was my age and lived a few rooms down, and she also took me under her wing. Nina had just returned from a month in the SHU. She had refused to shovel snow, and was waiting to get put back in the dorms. Annette seemed scared of most other prisoners, but not Nina, who was Brooklyn street smart and just as wary of others as Annette. "They're all wackos. They make me sick." She had lived a tough life and was prison-savvy, funny as hell, and surprisingly tolerant of my naivete, and I followed her around like a puppy. I paid close attention to her advice about how not to get rooked by another prisoner. I was definitely interested in figuring out who the non-wackos were. I got along well with some of the women in my A&O group, plus I could remember their names. The tattooed Latina from my room, who was doing just 6 months for getting caught with 6 keys of coke in her car, made no sense to me. The salty redhead, who was still going on about how much better the prison in West Virginia was than Danbury. Although there's more of us Northerners here, if you know what I mean. Then there was little Janet from Brooklyn, who was slowly warming up to me, although she still seemed to think I was strange for being friendly. She was just 20 years old, a college girl who had been arrested on vacation as a drug mule. She had been locked in a Caribbean jail for an entire harrowing year before the feds came to get her. Now she was doing 60 months. More than half of her 20s would be spent behind bars. One day I was joined at lunch by a different Janet, who was 50-ish, tall, fair, and striking. I had been watching her and wondering what her story was. She reminded me of my aunt. Janet was like me, a middle-class drug criminal. She was doing a 2-year sentence on a marijuana charge. As we made conversation, she was friendly but never pushy, explicitly respectful of other people's space. I learned that she was a world traveler, a classic eco-peacenik intellectual, a fitness fanatic and yoga expert, and a devout Buddhist possessed of a wry sense of humor, all incredibly welcome attributes to encounter in a fellow prisoner. Institutional food required a Zen outlook. The mess hall lunch was sometimes hot, sometimes not, the most popular meals being McDonald's-style hamburger patties or the ultimate and rare deep-fried chicken sandwich. People went crazy for chicken in any form. Far more often, lunch was bologna and rubbery orange cheese on white bread, and endless amounts of cheap and greasy starch in the form of rice, potatoes, and horrible frozen pizzas. Dessert was wildly variable. Sometimes really good home-baked cookies or cake, sometimes Jell-O, and sometimes bowls of pudding, which I was warned off of. It comes out of cans marked Desert Storm, and if there's mold on the top, they just scrape it off and serve the rest. For the few vegetarians, there was texturized vegetable protein. TVP was a repulsive reconstituted soy powder that someone back in the kitchen would fruitlessly try to make edible. It usually looked like worms. Sometimes if they had added a list of onions, you could choke it down. Poor Yoga Janet was a vegetarian and resigned herself to a subsistence diet most of the time. Both lunch and dinner featured a salad bar that offered iceberg lettuce, sliced cucumbers, and raw cauliflower. Only certain women, like Yoga Janet, were regulars at the salad bar. I said hello to them shyly, my sisters in roughage. Occasionally, other vegetables would appear on the bar: broccoli florets, canned bean sprouts, celery, carrots, and very rarely raw spinach. These would quickly be raided and spirited out of the dining hall for prisoners' cooking projects, which went on in force in the 2 microwaves near the dorms. The only food available was what we got in the dining hall and what prisoners were able to buy from the commissary. A constant presence in the dining hall was Italian Nina's former bunkie Pop, the imposing 50-ish wife of a Russian gangster who ruled the kitchen with an iron fist. One evening, I was sitting with Nina as the dinner hour was drawing to a close when Pop sat down with us, clad in her customized burgundy kitchen smock adorned with Pop over the heart in white yarn, a la Laverne and Shirley. I, knowing less than nothing, began maligning the food. It didn't occur to me at that point that anyone would put any pride into their prison job, but Pop did. When I made a joke about a hunger strike, that was it. Pop fixed me with a ferocious glare and pointed a finger. "Listen, honey, I know you just got here, so I know that you don't understand what's what. I'm gonna tell you this once. There's something here called inciting a riot, and that kind of shit you're talking about, hunger strikes, that kind of shit, that's inciting a riot. You can get in big trouble for that. They will lock your ass up in the SHU in a heartbeat. Now me, I don't care, but you don't know these people, honey. The wrong one hears you saying that shit, she goes and tells the CO, you're going to be shocked how quickly the lieutenant is coming to lock your ass up. So take a tip from me and watch what you say." And with that, she left. Nina looked at me, silently telegraphing, "You asshole." From then on, I stayed out of Pop's path, ducking my head to avoid her eyes on the chow line. February is Black History Month, and someone had festooned the dining hall with posters of Martin Luther King Jr., George Washington Carver, and Rosa Parks. "They didn't put shit up for Columbus Day," groused a woman named Lombardi behind me in line one day. Was she really objecting to Dr. King? I kept my mouth shut. The minimum security camp at Danbury housed approximately 200 women at any given time, though sometimes it climbed to a nightmarishly cramped 250. About half were Latino, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Colombian. About 24% white, 24% African American and Jamaican, and then a very random smattering. One Indian, a couple of Middle Eastern women, a couple of Native Americans, and one tiny Chinese woman in her 60s. I always wondered how it felt to be there if you lacked a tribe. It was all so very West Side Story. Stick to your own kind, Maria. The racialism was unabashed. The three main dorms had organizing principles, allegedly instituted by the counselors who assigned housing. A dorm was known as the suburbs, B dorm was dubbed the ghetto, and C dorm was Spanish Harlem. The rooms, where all new people went first, were a strange mix. Butorsky wielded housing assignments as a weapon, so if you got on his bad side, you would be stuck into rooms. The most physically ill women in the camp, or pregnant women like the one I had seen when I first arrived, occupied the bottom bunks. The top bunks were full of newbies, or behavior problems, of which there was never a shortage. Room 6, where I lived, was serving as a sick ward rather than a punishment room. I was lucky. At night, I would lie in the dark in my bunk over the snoring Polish woman, listening to the thrum of Annette's breathing apparatus and gazing past the sleeping top bunk shapes out the windows, which were level with my bunk. When there was a moon, I could see the tops of fir trees and the white hills of the far valley. I spent as many hours as I could standing out in the cold, staring to the east over an enormous Connecticut valley. The camp sat perched atop one of the highest hills in the area, and you could see rolling hills and farms and clusters of towns for miles over the giant basin of the valley below. I saw the sun rise every day in February. I braved the rickety, icy stairs that led down to a field house gym and the camp's frozen track, where I'd crunch around, bundled in my ugly brown coat and itchy army green hat, muffler, and mittens, before heading into the cold gym to lift weights, almost always mercifully alone. I wrote letters and read books. But time was a beast, a big, indolent, immovable beast that wasn't interested in my efforts at hastening it in any direction. Some days I barely spoke, keeping eyes open and mouth shut. I was afraid less of physical violence, I hadn't seen any evidence of it, than of getting cursed out publicly for fucking up, either breaking a prison rule or a prisoner's rule. Be in the wrong place at the wrong time, sit in someone's seat, intrude where you are not wanted, ask the wrong question, and you get called out and bawled out in a hurry, either by a terrifying prison guard or by a terrifying convict, sometimes in Spanish. Except to pester Nina with questions and to theorize and trade notes with my fellow A&O newbies about what was what, I kept to myself. But my fellow prisoners were, in fact, looking out for me. Wormtown Rosemarie brought me her Wall Street Journal every day and checked on how I was. Yoga Janet would make a point of sitting with me at meals, and we would chat about the Himalayas and New York and politics. She was appalled when a subscription to the New Republic showed up for me at mail call. "You might as well read the Weekly Standard," she said with disgust. One commissary day, shopping was twice a week in the evening, half the camp on Monday, the other half on Tuesday, Nina appeared in the door of room 6. Still without money in my prison account, I was washing with loaned soap and was deeply envious of the other prisoners' weekly shopping excursions. "Hey, Piper, how about a root beer float?" said Nina. "What?" I was dumbfounded and hungry. Dinner had been roast beef with an eerie metallic green cast. I had eaten rice and cucumbers. "I'm going to get some ice cream at commissary. We can make root beer floats." My heart soared, then crashed. "I can't shop, Nina. My account didn't clear yet." "Would you shut up? Come on." You could get a pint of cheap ice cream at the commissary, vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry. You had to eat it right away because, of course, there was no freezer, just a big ice dispenser for prisoners. Woe to the inmate who stuck a pint into the ice machine and got caught by another inmate. You would get yelled at for being disgustingly unsanitary. Like many things, it just wasn't done. Nina bought vanilla ice cream and 2 cans of root beer. My mouth was watering as she prepared our floats in plastic coffee mugs, the foam a luscious rich brown. She handed me one, and I sipped, wearing a foam mustache. It was the best thing I had tasted since I got to prison. I felt tears pricking behind my eyes. I was so happy. "Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much." At mail call, I continued to be blessed with an avalanche of letters, every one of which I savored. Some were from my closest friends, some were from family, and some were from people I had never met. Friends of friends who had heard about me and taken the time to offer some solace with pen and paper to a total stranger. Larry told me that one of our friends had told her folks about me, and her father had decided to read every one of the books on my Amazon wish list. In short order, I had accumulated, via the mail, beautiful postcards from my old co-worker Kelly and letters written on my friend Aaron's exquisitely decorated writing paper, which were a treasure in the drab ugliness of the facility. 7 print-out pages of Stephen Wright jokes from Bill Graham. A little book about coffee, hand-illustrated by my friend Peter, and a lot of photographs of other people's cats. These were all of my riches, and in fact, my only valuable possessions. My uncle, Winthrop Allen III, wrote to me, "Pipes, your web page was well received. I forwarded it to a few of my friends and acquaintances, so don't be surprised to get bundles of old books from unknown sources." Enclosed is Japanese street slang. You never know when you're going to need just the right insult. Joe Orton, he needs no introduction, but there is one in the front of the book anyhow. Parkinson was an amusing old duffer, inventor of Parkinson's Law, which I kind of forgot. No, I remember now. It's about tasks expanding to fill the available time. When you are finished getting your group therapy sessions, safe sex lectures, and 12-step sermons, you may be able to test the hypothesis. The Prince, Max, my all-time fave. Like you and me, he's forever maligned. Gravity's Rainbow. All my literary friends consider this the greatest since Under the Volcano. I couldn't finish either of them. I enclose a couple of posters so that you could get a start on decorating the digs before Martha shows up with all her bundles of frou-frou. Regards, Winthrop, the worst uncle. I began to receive letters from a man named Joe Loya, a writer and a friend back in San Francisco. Joe explained that he had served over 7 years in federal prison for bank robbery, that he knew what I was going through, and that he hoped I would write him back. He told me that the act of writing literally saved his life when he spent 2 years in solitary confinement. I was startled by the intimacy of his letters, but also touched. And it was reassuring to know that there was someone on the outside who understood something about the surreal world I now inhabited. Only the nun got more mail than me. On my first day in the camp, someone had helpfully informed me that there was a nun there. In my side-smacked days, I vaguely assumed they meant a nun who had chosen to live among prisoners. I was correct, sort of. Sister Ardith Platy was a political prisoner, one of several nuns who are peace activists, and served long federal sentences for trespassing in a nonviolent protest at a Minuteman III missile silo in Colorado. Everyone respected Sister, as she was known to all, who was 69 years old and one tough nun, an adorable, elfin, twinkling, and loving presence. Appropriately enough, Sister was Yoga Janet's bunkie. She liked to be tucked into bed by Janet every night, with a hug and kiss on her soft, wrinkled forehead. The Italian-American prisoners were the most outraged by her predicament. "The fucking feds have nothing better to do than lock up nuns?" they would spit, disgusted. Sister received copious amounts of mail from pacifists around the world. One day, I got a new letter from my best friend, Kristen, whom I had met in our first week at Smith. In the envelope was a short note penned on an airplane and a newspaper clipping. I unfolded it to reveal Bill Cunningham's On the Street fashion column from the Sunday New York Times, February 8th. Covering the half-page were over a dozen photographs of women of every age, race, size, and shape, all clad in brilliant orange. Orangina's Uncorked was the headline, and Kristen had noted on a blue sticky, "New Yorkers wear orange in solidarity with Piper's plight. XOK." I carefully stuck the clipping inside my locker door, where every time I opened it, I was greeted by my dear friend's handwriting and the smiling faces of women with orange coats, hats, scarves, even baby carriages. Apparently, orange was the new black. Chapter 5. Down the Rabbit Hole. After 2 weeks, I was getting much better at cleaning, as inspections took place twice a week and there was considerable social pressure not to fuck up. The winners of inspection got to eat first, and certain extra-tidy honor cubes were first among the first. It was amazing how many uses sanitary napkins had. They were our primary cleaning tools. There was tension in Room 6 over who cleaned and who did not. Miss Luce, who was in her 70s and sick with cancer, was not expected to clean. The Puerto Rican woman in one of the top bunks spoke no English, but she would silently help me and Annette dust and scrub. The bigoted Polish woman who occupied the bunk below me refused to clean, much to Annette's fury. My tattooed A&O pal pitched in half-heartedly, until she discovered she was pregnant and was quickly moved to a bottom bunk in another room. The BOP doesn't like lawsuits. The new girl who took her place in Room 6 was a big Spanish girl. At first I used the politically correct term Latina, as I had learned to do at Smith, but everyone, regardless of color, looked at me as if I were insane. Finally, I was firmly corrected by a Dominican woman. "We call ourselves Spanish around here, honey. Spanish mommies." This new young Spanish mommy sat on the naked mattress of the top bunk, looking dazed. It was my turn to show someone else the ropes. "What's your name?" "Maria Carbone." "Where are you from?" "Lowell." "In Massachusetts? I'm from there. I grew up in Boston." "How much time do you have?" She looked at me blankly. "That means, how long is your sentence?" "I don't know." That stopped me cold. How could you not know your own sentence? I didn't think this was a language problem. Her English was unaccented. I got worried. She looked like she was in shock. Listen, Maria, it's going to be okay. We'll help you. You need to fill out your paperwork, and people will give you the stuff you need right away. Who's your counselor? Maria just looked at me helplessly. And finally, I retreated to enlist one of the other Spanish mommies to assist with the new arrival. One evening, the PA system boomed, "Kerman!" and I scurried to Mr. Butorski's office. "You're moving down into B dorm," he barked. "Cube 18. Miss Malcolm will be your bunkie." I hadn't been down to the dorms, which were out of bounds for A&Os. In my imagination, they were murky caves populated with seasoned convicts. "He likes you," said Nina, my expert on all things prison, who was still waiting to get back into her A-dorm cube with Pop. "That's why he put you with Miss Malcolm. She's been down a long time. Plus, you'll always be on her cube." I had no idea who Miss Malcolm was, but I had learned that in prison, Miss was an honorific conferred only on the elderly or on those who were highly respected. I gathered my few belongings and nervously advanced down the stairs to B dorm, also known as the ghetto, clutching my pillow and laundry bag stuffed with uniforms. I would have to retrieve my pile of books on a second trip. The dorms turned out to be large, semi-subterranean basement rooms that were a maze of beige cubicles, each housing 2 prisoners, a bunk bed, 2 metal lockers, and a stepladder. Cube 18 turned out to be next to the bathroom, on the sole wall with narrow windows. Miss Malcolm was waiting for me in her cube, a petite, dark-skinned, middle-aged woman with a heavy Caribbean accent. She was all business. "And that's your locker," she indicated the empty one. "And these are your hooks. Those hooks are mine, and that's just the way it's going to be." Her clothes were neatly hung, with her checkered cook's pants and burgundy smock. She worked in the kitchen. "I don't care if you're gay or what, but I don't want no foolishness in the bunk. I clean on Sunday nights. You'll have to help clean." "Of course, Miss Malcolm," I agreed. "Call me Natalie. I'll make your bed." Suddenly, a blonde head popped up over the cubicle wall. "Hi, new neighbor." It was the tall, baby-faced white girl who washed dishes in the dining hall. "I'm Colleen." Colleen looked at my new bunkie cautiously. "How are you, Miss Natalie?" "Hello, Colleen." Natalie's tone expressed tolerance for silly girls, but tolerance with limits. It wasn't unfriendly or mean, just a bit stern. "What's your name, neighbor?" I introduced myself, and she bounced out of the top bunk and around to the opening of the cube I now shared with Miss Malcolm. I was pelted with questions about my cool, weird name, how much time I had, and where I was from, and I tried to answer them one at a time. Colleen was the resident camp artist, specializing in flowers, fairy princesses, and fancy lettering, and she said, "Oh, shit, neighbor. I gotta make your name tag. Write down the spelling for me." Colleen illustrated cubicle name tags for all new B-dorm arrivals in feminine script with sparkle details on each one, except for the people who had spent time down the hill in the FCI, and thus already had official-looking black plastic ones with white lettering, like Natalie's. I had won the bunkie lottery. Natalie, a woman near the end of an 8-year sentence, was a reserve of quiet dignity and good counsel. Because of her heavy accent, it took careful listening on my part to understand everything she said, but she never said anything unnecessary. She was the head baker in the kitchen. She rose at 4 a.m. to begin her shift, and kept largely to herself with a few select friends among the West Indian women and her kitchen co-workers. She spent quiet time reading, walking the track, and writing letters, and went to bed early, at 8 p.m. We spoke very little about our lives outside of prison, but she could answer just about any question I had about life at Danbury. She never said what had landed her there, and I never asked. How Natalie got to sleep at 8 p.m. was a complete mystery to me, because it was loud down in B dorm. My first evening there, I was quiet as a mouse in my top bunk, trying to follow the hooting and hollering that took place across the big room filled with women. I was worried that I would never get any sleep, and that I would lose my marbles in the cacophony. When the main lights were shut off, though, it quieted down pretty quickly, and I could fall asleep, lulled by the breathing of 47 other people. The next morning, something woke me before dawn. Groggy and confused, I sat up in my bed, the room still dark, the collective slumber of its residents blanketing everything. Something was going on. I could hear someone, not shouting exactly, but angry. I looked below me. Natalie was already gone, at work. I leaned forward very slowly, very cautiously, and peeped outside of my cubicle. 2 cubes away, I could see a Spanish woman who'd been particularly loud the night before. She was not happy. What was pissing her off, I could not figure out. Suddenly, she squatted for a few moments, then stood up and stalked off, leaving behind a puddle in front of my neighbor's cubicle. I rubbed my eyes. Did I just see what I thought I saw? About a minute later, a black woman emerged from the cubicle. "Lily Cabrales! Lily Cabrales, get back here this minute and clean this up! Lily!" People were not happy to be awakened this way, and a smattering of "shut the fuck up" broke out across the big room. I ducked my head back out of sight. I didn't want either woman to know that I had seen the whole thing. I could hear someone cursing quietly. I cautiously stole a glance. The black woman quickly cleaned up the puddle with an enormous wad of toilet paper. She caught me peeking and seemed sheepish. I flopped back down on my bunk and stared at the ceiling. I had fallen down the rabbit hole. The next day was Valentine's Day, my first holiday in prison. Upon arrival in Danbury, I was struck by the fact that there did not seem to be any lesbian activity. The rooms, so close by the guards station, were bastions of propriety. There was no cuddling or kissing or any obvious sexual activity on display in any of the common rooms, and while someone had told me a story about a former inmate who had made the gym her own personal love shack, it was always empty when I went there. Given that, I was taken aback by the explosion of sentiment around me on Valentine's Day morning in B dorm. Handmade cards and candy were exchanged, and I was reminded of the giddy intrigue of a 5th-grade classroom. Some of the B minds that were stuck on the outside of cubicles were clearly platonic. But the amount of effort that had gone into some of the valentines, carefully constructed from magazine clippings and scavenged materials, suggested real ardor to me. I had decided from the beginning to reveal nothing about my sapphic past to any other inmate. If I had told even one person, eventually the whole camp would know, and no good could come of it. So I talked a lot about my darling fiancé, Larry, and it was known in the camp that I was not that way, but I was not at all freaked out by the women who were that way. Frankly, most of these women were not even close to being real lesbians in my mind. They were, as Officer Scott put it, gay for the stay, the prison version of lesbian until graduation. It was hard to see how a person could conduct an intimate relationship in such an intensely overcrowded environment, let alone an illicit relationship. On a practical level, where on earth could you be alone in the camp without getting caught? A lot of the romantic relationships I observed were more like schoolgirl crushes, and it was rare for a couple to last more than a month or two. It was easy to tell the difference between women who were lonely and wanted comfort, attention, and romance, and a real live lesbian. There were a few of them. There were other big barriers for long-term lovers, like having sentences of dramatically different lengths, living in different dorms, or becoming infatuated with someone who wasn't actually a lesbian. Colleen and her bunkie next door got lots of valentines from other prisoners. I got none. But that evening's mail call yielded plenty of evidence that I was loved. best of all was a little book of Neruda poems from Larry, 20 love poems and a song of despair. I resolved to read a poem every day. We have lost even this twilight. No one saw us this evening hand in hand, while the blue night dropped on the world. I have seen from my window the fiesta of sunset in the distant mountain tops. Sometimes a piece of sun burned like a coin between my hands. I remembered you with my soul clenched, in that sadness of mine that you know. Where were you then? Who else was there? Saying what? Why will the whole of love come on me suddenly, when I am sad and feel you are far away? The book fell that is always turned to at twilight, and my cape rolled like a hurt dog at my feet. Always, always you recede through the evenings, towards where the twilight goes erasing statues. I was finally able to shop commissary on February 17th, when I bought extra-large sweatpants, $24.70, given to me in error and which they would not let me return, a stick of cocoa butter, $4.30, packets of tuna, sardines, and mackerel, each about $1, ramen noodles, 25 cents, squeezed cheese, $2.80, pickled jalapenos, $1.90, hot sauce, $1.40, legal pads, pens, envelopes, and stamps, priceless. I desperately wanted to buy a cheap little portable headset radio for $42.90. The radio would have cost about $7 on the street. At the base pay for federal prisoners, which is 14 cents an hour, that radio could represent more than 300 hours of labor. I needed the radio to hear the weekend movie or anything on television, and to use down in the gym, but the officer who ran the commissary brusquely told me they were out of radios. No mas, Kerman. Because I could count on money from the outside world, I could buy items to return to each person who had helped me upon my arrival: soap, toothpaste, shampoo, shower shoes, packets of instant coffee. Some women tried to wave them away. "Don't worry about it, Kerman," but I insisted. "Please, forget it," said Annette, who had loaned me so many things in my first several weeks. "You're like my daughter. Hey, did you get any new books today?" The books continued to pour in at mail call. It had gotten to the point where I was embarrassed, and also it made me nervous. It was a clear demonstration that I had it like that on the outside, a network of people who had both a concern for me and the time and money to buy me books. So far, no one had threatened me with anything more intimidating than a scowl or a harsh word, and no other prisoner had asked anything of me. Still, I was guarded against getting played, used, or targeted. I saw that some of the women had little or no resources from the outside to help make their prison life livable, and many of my fellow prisoners were seasoned hustlers. One day, right after I moved into B-dorm, a woman I didn't know popped her head into my cube. Miss Natalie was absent, and I was putting still more books away in my small footlocker, which was threatening to overflow. I looked at this woman, black, middle-aged, ordinary, yet unfamiliar. My guard went up. "Hey there, new bunkie. Where's Miss Natalie?" She's in the kitchen, I think." "What's your name?" "I'm Rochelle." "Piper. Kerman." "What's your name?" "You can call me Piper." What did she want from me? I felt trapped in my cube. I was sure she was sniffing around. "Oh, you're the one with the books. You got all them books." In fact, I had a book in my hand and a pile of them on top of the locker. By now, I was scared as to what this woman wanted from me and what she was going to do to me. Do you want a book?" I was always happy to lend a book, but only a few people took me up on it, checking my haul at every mail call. "Okay, what you got?" I scanned the selection. The collected works of Jane Austen, a biography of John Adams, Middlesex, Gravity's Rainbow, I didn't want to assume that she wouldn't want any of these books, but how could I know what she liked? "What kind of stuff do you like? You can borrow any of them. Take your pick." She looked through the titles uncertainly. It was a long, slow, squirmy moment for both of us. "How about this one? It's really, really fantastic." I seized up a copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. I felt racist on every level of my being by picking the black book from the stack for Rochelle, but there was a good shot that she might like it, might take it, and might leave me alone, at least for the moment. "Looks good, looks good. Thanks, Pipe." And she disappeared from my cube. About a week later, Rochelle came back around. She was returning the book. "It seems good, but I couldn't really get into it," she said. "You got the coldest winter ever, Sister Soldier?" I did not, and she wandered away. When I thought about how terrified I had been of Rochelle, and why, I felt like a complete jackass. I had gone to school with, lived with, dated, and worked with middle-class black people my whole life, but when faced by a black woman who hadn't been where I've been, I felt threatened, absolutely certain she was going to take something from me. In truth, Rochelle was one of the most mild-mannered and pleasant people around, with a deep love for church and trashy novels. Ashamed, I resolved not to be a jackass again. While I was meeting all these new players in my life, I made an extra effort to hang out with Annette. When I was moving down to B-dorm, she had sighed, resigned. "Now I'm never going to see you any more." "Annette, that's ridiculous. I'm literally yards away from you." "I've seen it before. Once girls get moved down to dorms, they don't have time for me anymore." Annette was trapped in the rooms because of her medical problems, so I made a point of going around to room 6 to say hi and play cards in the recreation room. But I was officially bored with Rummy 500, and less inclined to spend time with a small handful of often cranky, middle-aged white women than I once had been. Perhaps I would learn spades. Those players looked like they were having more fun. Natalie had the respect of everyone in B-dorm, and as I was clearly not going to give her any trouble, she seemed to take to me, too. Despite her reserve and discretion, she had a dry but lively sense of humor and treated me to her sharp, sidelong observations on our daily life in B-dorm. "You in the ghetto now, Bunky?" Ginger Solomon, her best friend, who was also Jamaican, was like the yang to Natalie's yin, antic, combustible, and loud. Miss Solomon was also a fantastic cook, and once she and Natalie had decided that I was all right, she would make me a plate of her special Saturday night dinner, usually a knockout curry prepared with kitchen contraband. On special occasions, Natalie would magically make roti appear. Extracurricular prison cooking happened primarily in 2 communal microwaves that were placed in kitchenette areas between the dorms. Their use was a privilege the staff constantly, and with great enjoyment, threatened to revoke. Remarkable concoctions came out of those microwaves, especially from homesick Spanish and West Indian women. This impressed me deeply, given the limited resources these cooks were working with. Junk food and poly-bagged chicken, packets of mackerel and tuna, and whatever fresh vegetable one could steal from the kitchen. Corn chips could be reconstituted into mash with water and transformed into delectable chilaquiles, my new prison favorite. Contraband onions were at a particular premium, and the chefs had to keep an eye peeled for guards with quivering nostrils. No matter what they were cooking, it smelled like food prepared with love and care. Unfortunately, Miss Solomon only cooked on Saturdays. I had lost 10 pounds in a month, thanks to the prison diet, all the liver, lima beans, and iceberg lettuce you want. The day I walked into prison, I looked all of my 34 years, if not worse. In the months before my surrender, I'd drowned my sorrows in wine and New York comfort food. Now my greatest comforts were time alone on the icy track and lifting weights in the gym. It was the only place in the camp where freedom and control seemed in my grasp. One of the good things about living in B Dorm was that you had your choice of 2 bathrooms. Both were equipped with 6 showers, 5 sinks, and 6 toilet stalls. That's where their similarities ended. Natalie and I lived next to the bathroom that I like to call the Hellmouth. The tiles and formica were various shades of gray. The shower curtain rods were rusted. The plastic shower curtains were practically in ribbons, and not all of the stall door locks worked. None of this was what made the C Dorm bathroom a hellmouth, though. It was the infestations that made the place unacceptable for anything but a quick pee or toothbrushing. During the warmer months, when the ground was not frozen, little black maggots would periodically appear in the shower area, squirming on the tiles. Nothing could make them disappear, although the bathroom orderlies did not have much of an arsenal. The cleaning supplies were stingily doled out. Eventually, the maggots would hatch into evil little flies. They were the sign that the bathroom had been built over a direct route to hell. I showered instead in the bathroom on the other side of B Dorm, which connected to A Dorm. It was spa-like by comparison, and had been recently refurbished in shades of beige. The fixtures were new, the light was better, the mood was brighter, even if the shower curtains were just as ratty. Showers were a complex ritual. It was necessary to schlep all your hygiene products to the bathroom: shampoo, soap, razor, washcloth, and whatever else you might need. This required either great minimalism or some sort of shower caddy. Some women had illegal crocheted bags to carry their stuff. Some had mesh nylon bags from commissary, and one woman had a large pink plastic shower caddy, an actual shower caddy. I wasn't about to ask, knowing that it had either come from some long ago and distant commissary or was contraband. Morning and evening were peak shower hours, with gradually diminishing stores of hot water. If you showered in the afternoon or early evening, you would have less competition. We were not supposed to be in the showers after lights out at 10 p.m., to discourage people from having sex in them. Many women would wait in line 3 deep for their shower to be free. In the good bathroom, there was one shower stall that indisputably had the best water pressure. Some big shots, like Pop, would send an emissary to see if that stall was free, or else dibs them a place in the waiting line. If you interfered with one of the early morning risers' shower ritual by getting into their shower, you would be met with an icy stare when you emerged. Once you had secured your shower stall, you faced a moment of truth. Some women would disappear behind the stall's plastic curtain, still fully clad in their muumuus, out of modesty. Others would whip off their clothes in front of everyone and climb in and out unabashed. A handful would shower with the curtain open, giving everyone a show. At first I was among the former, but the water was always freezing initially, and I would yelp as it rained down on my naked skin. "What's going on in there, Kerman?" someone would inevitably joke. "Piper's getting busy." After a while, I became convinced that the Linda Blair rape scene in Born Innocent was never going to be recreated in the camp. So I took to starting my shower before I got in, checking to see that it was at least lukewarm before I whipped off my muumuu and jumped in. This won me a couple of fans, notably my new neighbor Delicious, who shouted with surprise, "P.I. Piper, you got some nice titties. You got those TV titties. They stand up on they own, all perky and everything. Damn." Thanks, Delicious." There was absolutely nothing threatening about Delicious's attention. In fact, it was mildly flattering that she noticed me at all. All cleaning in the camp was highly ritualized, including the all-hands-on-deck Sunday night scrub-down of our cubicles. One day a week, B Dorm's laundry was done for us. Laundress was a prison job, captained by an elderly woman everyone called Grandma, and so the night before, I'd stuff my bag with sweat socks and a packet of laundry soap. Natalie would wake me at 5:15 before the laundry opened so that I could get mine in before everyone else. Otherwise, I'd have been part of the usual stampede of half-asleep women in the still dark hallway, getting in line to drop off their laundry bags. Why the urgency? Unclear. Did I need my laundry back in the early afternoon, as opposed to the evening? No. I found myself participating in the meaningless rituals of avoiding the laundry rush, because prison is all about waiting in line. For many women, I realized, this was nothing new. If you had the misfortune of having the government intimately involved with your life, whether via public housing or Medicaid or food stamps, then you'd probably already spent an insane amount of your life in line. I had twice made the monthly pilgrimage out to the warehouse to collect my 8 packets of laundry soap powder from the unsmiling inmate in charge of issuing them. Laundry soap days happened once a month. On one appointed weekday, all the evens would troop out to the warehouse during the lunch hour to claim their 8 packets. The next day, the odds would go. The prisoners who worked in the warehouse, a secretive bunch, took this enterprise very seriously. They treated soap days as an invasion of their turf, and would all sit or stand silently while other prisoners lined up to collect the one handout that the prison gave to prisoners. I never understood why laundry soap was the one free thing provided to us, other than our toilet paper rations, which were passed out once a week, and the sanitary napkins and tampons stocked in the bathroom. Laundry soap was sold on commissary. Some women would buy Tide and give away their 8 free soap packets to others who had nothing. Why not soap to clean your body? Why not toothpaste? Somewhere within the monstrous bureaucracy of the Bureau of Prisons, this all made sense to someone. I carefully studied long-timers like Natalie. How had she done it? How had she served 8 years in this rotten place with her grace, her dignity, her sanity intact? What had she drawn on to make it through, with only 9 months until her release to the outside world? The advice I got from many quarters was, do your time, don't let the time do you. Like everyone in prison, I was going to have to learn from the masters. I settled into rituals, which improved the quality of my existence immeasurably. The ritual of coffee making and drinking was one of the first. The day I arrived, a brassy former stockbroker had given me instant coffee in a foil bag and a can of Cremora. Larry, an insufferable coffee snob, was insanely particular about brewing methods, preferring a French press. I wondered what he would do if he was locked up. Would he give up coffee entirely, or adapt to Nescafé? I would make my cup in the morning at the temperamental hot water dispenser and carry it down to the chow hall for breakfast. After our late afternoon dinner, Nina would often appear, inquiring whether I wanted to get coffee. I always did. We would mix up our cups and find seats where the weather allowed, sometimes sitting out behind A dorm looking south toward New York. We would talk about Brooklyn, her kids, Larry, and books. We'd gossip about other prisoners. I would ask her endless questions about how to do time. Sometimes Nina wasn't in the mood to get coffee. I'm sure that my tag-along tendencies got old for her, but when I needed her wisdom, she was always there. I tore through every book I received, stayed out of the TV rooms, and watched with envy as people went off to their prison jobs. One could rearrange a footlocker only so many ways. I suspected work would help slaughter time. I tried to figure out who did what, and why some of them got to wear nifty army green jumpsuits. Some prisoners worked in the camp's kitchen. Others, working as orderlies, washed floors and cleaned the bathroom and common areas. The benefit of the orderly jobs was that you worked only a few hours a day, usually alone. A handful of prisoners worked as trainers for seeing eye dogs with whom they lived 24/7, a program tragically known as Puppies Behind Bars. Some women worked in CMS, construction and maintenance services, getting on a bus every morning to do jobs like plumbing and grounds maintenance. An elite crew trooped off to the warehouse, the stopping point for everything that either entered or left the prison, and where the contraband opportunities were rich. Certain prisoners worked in Unicor, the prison industries company that operates within the federal prison system. Unicor manufactures a wide range of products that are then sold within the government for many millions of dollars. In Danbury, the FCI made radio components for the Army. Unicor paid significantly more than other prison jobs, over $1 an hour as opposed to the regular base pay rate of 14 cents an hour. And the Unicor workers were always dressed in pressed, tidy uniforms. Unicor people would disappear into a large warehouse building that always had semis parked outside. Some girls enjoyed silent flirtation with the truckers, who looked nervous but intrigued. Rosemarie had secured herself a job in the puppy program, which was housed in A dorm. That meant she lived with a Labrador retriever that was being trained to be a seeing eye dog or a bomb sniffer. The dogs were beautiful, the little puppies adorable. A warm, squirming lapful of golden puppy, licking and biting and unabashedly happy, made despair dissolve no matter how hard you were hanging on to it. I wasn't eligible for puppies behind bars. My 15-month sentence was too short. Initially disappointed, on reflection I decided it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The program attracted some of the most obsessive-compulsive women in the camp, and their OCD could really come into full flower as they trained the dogs, forming intense bonds with their canine companions and feuding with their human neighbors. Rosemarie quickly became consumed with the training of her dog, Amber. I didn't mind because she would usually let me play with the puppy, which some of her fellow dog trainers frowned upon. The doyenne of the puppy program was Mrs. Jones, the only person in camp that anyone called Mrs. Mrs. Jones had been in prison for a long time, and it was obvious. A grizzled, steel-haired Irish woman with enormous breasts, she had been down for almost 15 years on a drug sentence. Her husband was said to have beaten her viciously on the outside, and to have died in prison. Good riddance to bad rubbish. Mrs. Jones was a little crazy, but most prisoners and guards gave her more leeway than they might extend to others. After 15 years, anyone would have gone a little crazy. People liked to sing a few bars of Me and Mrs. Jones from time to time. Some of the younger women from the street called her the OG, original gangster, and she loved that. "That's me, the OG. I'm crazy like a fox," she would cackle, tapping her temple. She seemed to lack any filter and would say exactly what she thought at any time. Although interacting with Mrs. Jones required patience, I liked her, and her candor, too. I wasn't allowed to be a dog trainer, but surely the right job for me was here somewhere. Danbury had a distinct labor hierarchy, and I was at the bottom of it. I wanted to teach in the GED program, which was overseen by a staff teacher and augmented by prisoners who were tutors. The handful of middle-class, educated prisoners with whom I often ate meals warned me against it. Although the program's female staffer was well-liked, they said the combination of a bad program with captive and often surly students made for a crappy work environment. Not a pleasant experience. Clusterfuck. I copped out after a month. It sounded like my friend Ed's job teaching public high school in New York City. Nevertheless, I requested the job, and Mr. Butorsky, who controlled assignments, said that should work out just fine. As it turned out, he was not as good as his word. Chapter 6. High Voltage. One morning, my A&O pal, little Janet, found me and said, "We have jobs." We were assigned to the electric shop, in construction and maintenance services. I was disappointed. What about teaching? Feeding the hungry minds of the downtrodden, which were waiting to break free? The mandatory GED program had been temporarily shut down. The 2 classrooms had been overrun with a virulent, toxic killer mold that crawled over textbooks, walls, and furniture and made many people sick. The inmate teachers had reportedly sneaked samples of the mold to a sympathetic outsider for analysis and filed a grievance. The staff teacher had sided with the prisoners, to the fury of prison management. The students were gleeful about the shutdown, most of them not wanting to be there in the first place. So, it was voltage for me instead. The next day, little Janet and I followed the other CMS workers out into the March chill, to a big white school bus parked behind the chow hall. After more than a month of being trapped in the confines of the camp, the bus ride was exhilarating. We rode around to the back of the FCI and were deposited amid an assembly of low buildings. These were the CMS shops: garage, plumbing, safety, construction, carpentry, grounds, and electric, each housed in its own building. Janet and I entered the electric shop, blinking in the sudden dimness we found there. The room had a cement floor half filled with chairs, many broken, a desk with a television sitting on it, and blackboards where someone was keeping a large hand-drawn monthly calendar, crossing off the days. There was a refrigerator and a microwave and a feeble-looking potted plant. One alcove was caged off and brightly lit, filled with enough tools to stock a small hardware store. An enclosed office had a door plastered with union stickers. My fellow prisoners grabbed all the functional seats. I sat on the desk next to the TV. The door banged open. "Good morning." A tall, bearded man with buggy eyes and a trucker hat strode through to the office. Joyce, who was friendly with Janet, said, "That's Mr. DeSimon." About 10 minutes later, DeSimon emerged from the office and took roll call. He sized up each of us as he read out our names. "The clerk will explain the tool room rules," he said. "Break the rules, you're going to the SHU." He went back into the office. We looked at Joyce. "Are we going to do any work?" She shrugged. "Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. It just depends on his mood." "Kerman!" I jumped. I looked at Joyce. She widened her eyes at me. "Go in there," she hissed. I cautiously approached the office door. "Can you read, Kerman?" "Yes, Mr. DeSimon, I can read." "Good for you. Read this." He dropped a primer on his desk. "And get your convict buddies who are new to read it, too. You'll be tested on it." I backed out of the office. The packet was a basic course in electrics: power generation, electrical current, and basic circuitry. I thought for a moment about the safety requirements of the job and looked around at my co-workers with some concern. There were a couple of old hands, like Joyce, who was Filipina and sarcastic as hell. Everyone else was new like me. In addition to little Janet, there was Shirley, an extremely nervous Italian who seemed to think she was going to be shanked at any moment; Yvette, a sweet Puerto Rican who was halfway through a 14-year sentence and yet still had, at most, 17 words of English at her command; and Levy, a tiny French-Moroccan Jew who claimed to have been educated at the Sorbonne. For all her preening about her Sorbonne education, Levy was totally useless at our electrical studies. We spent a couple of weeks studying those primers. Well, some of us did. At which point, we were given a test. Everyone cheated, sharing the answers. I was pretty sure there would be no repercussions to either flunking the test or being caught cheating. It all seemed absurd to me. No one was going to get fired for incompetence. However, simple self-preservation demanded that I read and remember the explanations of how to control electric current without frying myself. This was not how it was all going to end for me, sprawled in polyester khaki on linoleum, with a tool belt strapped to my waist. One snowy day, just a week later, we reported to the electric shop after lunch to find DeSimon jingling the keys to the big white electric shop van. "Kerman, Reales, Levy, get in the van." We trundled out and climbed in after him. The van sped down a hill, past a building that housed a daycare for the children of COs, and through a cluster of about a dozen little white government houses where some COs lived. We often spent our workdays changing exterior light bulbs or checking the electric panels in these buildings. But today, DeSimon didn't stop. Instead, he pulled off of prison property and onto the main thoroughfare that skirted the institution. Little Janet and Levy and I looked at each other in astonishment. Where on earth was he taking us? About a quarter-mile from the prison grounds, the van pulled up next to a small concrete building in a residential neighborhood. We followed DeSimon up to the building, which he unlocked. A mechanical din came from inside. "What is this place, Mr. DeSimon?" asked Levy. "Pump house. Controls water to the facility," he replied. He looked around the interior and then locked the door again. "Stay here." And with that, he climbed into the van and drove away. Little Janet, Levy, and I stood there outside the building with our mouths open. Was I hallucinating? Had he really just left us here in the outside world? 3 uniformed prisoners, out and about? Was this some sort of sick test? Little Janet, who before Danbury had been locked up for over 2 years in extremely poor conditions, looked like she was in shock. Levy was agitated. "What is he thinking? What if people see us? They will know we are prisoners." "There is no way that this is not against the rules," I said. "We're gonna get in trouble," little Janet wailed. I wondered what would happen if we left. Obviously, we would be in massive trouble and be sent to the SHU and probably catch a new charge for escape. But how long would it take them to nab us? "Look at these houses. Oh my God, a school bus. I miss my children." Levy started to cry. I felt terrible for anyone who was separated from her children by prison. But I also knew that Levy's kids lived nearby and that she would not allow them to come visit her because she didn't want them to see her in prison. I thought this was horrible, and that for a kid, the unpleasantness of the prison setting would be more than offset by the eyewitness reassurance that their mother was okay. Anyway, I wanted Levy to stop crying. "Let's look around," I said. "No!" little Janet practically shouted. "Piper, we are going to get in so much trouble. Don't even move your feet." She looked so stressed that I acquiesced. We stood there like idiots. Nothing was happening. The suburban neighborhood was quiet. Every couple of minutes a car would drive by. No one pointed or screeched to a halt at the sight of 3 convicts off the plantation. Eventually, a man walked by with an enormous shaggy dog. I perked up. I can't tell if that's a Newfoundland or a Great Pyrenees. Good-looking dog, huh? "I can't believe you. You're looking at the dog?" said little Janet. The man was looking at us. "He sees us?" "Of course he sees us, Levy. We're 3 female inmates standing on a street corner. How's he going to miss us?" The man raised his hand and waved cheerfully as he passed. After about 45 minutes, DeSimon returned with brooms and set us to work cleaning the pump house. The next week, we were made to clean out the root cellar, a long, low barn on the prison grounds. The root cellar contained a hodgepodge of equipment from all the shops. In the dark shadows, we discovered enormous snake skins that had been shed, which freaked us out and made DeSimon cackle with glee. An outside inspection was coming soon, and the prison staff wanted to be ready. There was actual trash to be removed from the root cellar, a dirty and often heavy job, and we spent days hauling huge metal pipes, stockpiles of hardware, fixtures, and components out to the giant dumpsters. Into the dumpster went ceramic bathtubs and sinks still in their boxes, new baseboard heating components, and unopened 50-pound boxes of nails. "Your family's tax dollars at work," we muttered under our breath. I had never worked so physically hard in my life. By the time we were finished, the root cellar was empty, spotless, and tidy for inspection. While I was quickly learning that even in prison, rules were made to be broken by staff and prisoners alike, There was one aspect of work in the electric shop that was meticulously observed and enforced. A large cage of tools, where the shop clerk sat, contained everything from band saws to Hilti drills to myriad types of special screwdrivers, pliers, wire cutters, and individual tool belts loaded with complete sets of the basics. A whole room filled with potentially murderous objects. There was a system for checking out those tools. Each prisoner had an assigned number and a bunch of corresponding metal chits that looked like dog tags. When we went out to do a job, each prisoner signed out a tool with a chit and was responsible for returning it. At the end of each shift, DeSimon would inspect the tool cage. He made it clear that if a tool went missing, the prisoner whose chit occupied the empty space and the shop clerk were both going to the SHU. It was the only rule that appeared to matter to him. One day, a drill bit went missing, and we tore the shop and the truck apart looking for it while he watched, the clerk on the edge of tears, until finally we found the twisted piece of metal rolling around in the lid of one of the toolboxes. DeSimon was relentlessly unpleasant to many of the prison staff as well, who called him Swamp Yankee, and worse. He may have been widely disliked, but he was also the head of the institution's union chapter, which meant that management let him do as he pleased. "DeSimon's a prick," one of the other shop heads told me candidly. "That's why we elected him." Under the prick's indifferent tutelage, I learned the rudimentary basics of electric work. A group of totally inexperienced women working with high voltage and nearly no supervision did yield moments of broad comedy and only occasional bodily injury. In addition to a butch tool belt, prison work gave me a greater sense of normalcy, another way of marking time, and people with whom I had something in common. Best of all, I was sent over to the garage to obtain my prison driving license, which allowed me to drive the CMS vehicles. Although I loathed DeSimon, I was glad to be kept semi-busy 5 days a week and ecstatic at the freedom of movement I had driving the electric shop van around the prison grounds. On a Friday, when we returned from work to the camp, Big Boo Clemens from B-Dorm came out to meet the CMS bus. "Guilty on all 4 counts," she reported with great excitement. Inside, we found the TV rooms packed, because a jury had found Martha Stewart guilty on 4 counts of obstructing justice and lying to investigators about a well-timed stock sale. The styled diva was going to have to do Fed time. Her case had been followed with keen interest at Danbury. Most prisoners thought she was being targeted because she was a famous female. Guys get away with that shit all the time. One afternoon, Levy, our nervous co-worker Shirley, and I, geared up in our tool belts, were shuttling around the staff housing on the grounds, checking the circuit panels in every house. DeSimon escorted us from house to house, where he would make small talk with the occupants while we did our thing. It was bizarre to go into the homes of our jailers and see their angel collections and family photos and pets and laundry and messy basements. "They have no class," sneered Levy. I didn't like prison guards, but she was insufferable. When we got back to the shop, DeSimon left, and it was up to us to clean out the truck and return the tools to the cage. That's when I discovered the extra screwdriver in my belt. "Levy, Shirley, I've got one of your screwdrivers." They both checked their belts. No, they had theirs. I held 2 screwdrivers in my hands, confused. "But if you've got yours, then where—" I was mystified. I must have picked this one up in one of the houses? My eyes met Levy and nervous Shirley's, which were huge. "What are you going to do?" Shirley hissed. My stomach dropped. I started to sweat. I saw myself in the SHU, with no visits from Larry, with another criminal charge for stealing a CO's potentially deadly screwdriver. And I had these 2 fools in on the game, no one's choice for accomplices. "I don't know what I'm going to do, but you don't know a thing about this, understand?" I hissed back. They hurried into the shop, and I stood outside, looking around wildly. What the fuck was I going to do with this screwdriver? I was terrified because I knew it could be construed as a weapon. How could I get rid of it? If I found a hiding place, what if someone found it? How did you destroy a screwdriver? My eyes fixed on the CMS dumpster. It was big, and all the shops threw their garbage, all kinds of garbage in there. It got emptied often, and the garbage was taken away, to Mars as far as I was concerned. I grabbed the shop garbage and strode toward the dumpster. I fiddled with the garbage bag while I surreptitiously wiped the screwdriver like a maniac, trying to get rid of fingerprints. Then I flung both into the dumpster, which unfortunately didn't sound very full. It was done. Heart pounding, I returned to the shop and put away my tool belt. I didn't even look at nervous Shirley or Levy. That night, I went over the screwdriver problem again and again in my mind. What if the CO noticed it was missing and remembered that inmates had been in his house? He would raise the alarm, and then what? An investigation, interrogations, and then Levy and nervous Shirley would give me up in a hot second. I closed my eyes. I was dead. The next morning at the shop, an eerie air raid siren went off. I almost vomited. Shirley looked faint. Levy appeared completely unconcerned. Usually the siren was used for recalls, sending us back to our housing units for either emergency or special practice counts. But this time, nothing happened. The alarm went off for many excruciating minutes until it stopped. Shirley went outside to smoke a cigarette with trembling hands. At lunch, I found Nina and told her what had happened, deeply rattled. She rolled her eyes. "Jesus Christ, Piper. Let's go look for it after lunch. You'll just give it to DeSimon and explain. They ain't gonna lock you up." But the dumpster was empty. Nina frowned and looked at me. I wanted to cry. "Nina, you don't think the siren this morning—" Although she was concerned, this struck her as hilarious. "No, Piper, I don't think the siren this morning was for you. I think the garbage is gone, and the screwdriver's gone, and if the evidence is gone, then they can't prove shit. Most likely, nothing at all's gonna happen, and if it does, it's your word against Levy or Shirley, and let's face it, they're wackos. Who's gonna believe them?" One afternoon, I returned to B-dorm to find my neighbor Colleen in a state of great excitement. "My girls Jay and Bobby just got here from Brooklyn. Pipester, you got any extra toothpaste I can give them or any other stuff?" Colleen explained that before she'd been designated to Danbury, she had spent time with her two friends in the Brooklyn Metropolitan Correctional Center, also known as a federal jail. Now her pals had just arrived off the transport bus. "They're both real cool, Piper. You'll like them." On my way to the gym, I saw a black woman and a white woman standing out behind the camp building in the early spring drizzle, staring up at the clouds. I didn't recognize them. I decided they must be Colleen's friends. "Hey, I'm Piper. Are you guys Colleen's friends? I live next to her. Let me know if you need anything." They lowered their faces from the sky and looked at me. The black woman was about 30, pretty and solidly built with high cheekbones. She looked like she'd been carved out of super smooth wood. The white woman was smaller and older, maybe 45, and had coarse skin like a coral reef and eyes with as many shades of blue as the ocean. Right now, they looked aquamarine. "Thanks," she said. "I'm Bobby. This is Jay. You got any cigarettes?" Her heavy New York accent suggested many late nights and many cigarettes. "Hi, Jay. No, sorry, I don't smoke. I've got toiletries, though, if you need." I was getting wet and it was cold. Still, I was curious about these two. "Kinda crap weather out here." At this, they looked at each other. "We ain't felt the rain for 2 years," said Jay, the black woman. "What?" "In Brooklyn, there's a little rec deck to take us up on, but it's covered over, barbed wire and shit. and you don't really see the sky," she explained. "So we don't mind the rain. We love it." And she put her head back again, face up, as close to the sky as it could get. In the electric shop, things were changing. Vera, the woman with the most experience, left to go to the only women's boot camp program in Texas. Boot camp, an early release program that has since been eliminated, was 6 hard months in the Texas heat, where rumor had it that you were housed in a giant tent and required to shave your pubic hair to make insect detection easier. Vera's departure to Texas meant that the leadership in the electric shop shifted to Joyce. Joyce was a reasonably confident replacement, having learned from Vera how to do the electric work that was required on a frequent or daily basis, changing 8-foot-long fluorescents, replacing the ballasts of light fixtures, installing new exit signs and fixtures, and checking circuit boards. Levy soon became the unifying factor in the shop. The rest of us united against her. She was insufferable, crying daily and complaining loudly and constantly about her measly 6-month sentence, asking inappropriate personal questions, trying to boss people around, and making appalling and loud statements about other prisoners' appearance and lack of education, sophistication, or class, as she put it. More than once, campers had to be talked out of kicking her ass, which was done by reminding them that she was not worth the trip to the SHU. Most of the time, she was nervous, verging on hysterical, which manifested in dramatic physical symptoms. An astonishing hive-like swelling made her look like the Elephant Man, and her always sweating hands made her particularly useless for working with electricity. DeSimon kept a television in the shop. He would periodically emerge from his office, toss a VHS tape at us, and grunt, "Watch this," then leave us for hours. These instructional videos explain the rudiments of electrical current and also very basic wiring procedures. While uninterested in the content of the videos, my co-workers quickly figured out how to rig up the TV with an illegal makeshift antenna. That way, we could watch Jerry Springer. One con would man the lookout post by the window to spot any approaching COs. I was trying to learn some Spanish, and my co-worker Yvette was very patiently trying to teach me, but what I managed to pick up was almost exclusively about food, sex, or curses. Yvette was by far the most competent of my co-workers, and she and I would often work together on any electrical job requiring proficiency with tools. This occasioned conversations where every sentence suffered from multiple fractures, coupled with a lot of cautious mime. Neither of us wanted to get shocked. I had already learned the hard way what that was like. Your head snaps back as if you've been kicked under the chin. Jay, my neighbor Colleen's pal, was assigned to the electric shop. She had been cleared to work back in the Brooklyn MCC, so her paperwork didn't take long. She got the clerk job. "As long as I don't have to touch wires and shit, I'm cool," she said. By default, she hung out with me at work. I was best buddies with Little Janet, and Little Janet was the only other black person in electric. As the New England spring took its sweet time arriving, the three of us occupied the bench in front of the shop, smoking and watching the comings and goings of other prisoners. The guards went in and out of their deluxe gym, which was located directly across from the electric building. There were long stretches of inactivity during which we shot the shit, about the drug game, distant memories for me, about New York City, where we all were from, about men, about life. Little Janet could hold her own with us, despite being 15 years younger, and I could hold my own with them, despite being white. Little Janet was excitable, eager to argue a point or show off a dance move or just act silly, while Jay was funny and mellow, with an easy laugh. She had served just 2 years of a 10-year sentence, but she never seemed bitter, just measured and mindful. But she had a quiet sadness about her, and a deep, still quality that seemed to be the part of her that she would not allow her surroundings and circumstances to destroy. When she talked about her sons, a teenager and an 8-year-old, Her face shone. I admired the humor and calm with which she handled her losses in our prison world. Her dignity was not as quiet as Natalie's, but was just as lovely. Joyce, from the electric shop, was going home soon. She had drawn the calendar on the blackboard in the shop and would cross off every day that passed with chalk. About a week before she was due for release, she asked if I would color her hair. I must have shown my surprise at the intimate request. "You're the only one I know who seems like they won't fuck it up," she explained in her sharp, matter-of-fact way. We went into the salon room off the camp's main hallway, a space that occupied as much room as the law library, about the size of a large closet. There were 2 old pink hair sinks with nozzles for rinsing, a couple of salon chairs in almost total disrepair, and some standing dryers that looked like they were from the early 1960s. Shears and other cutting instruments were kept in a locked cage mounted on the wall. Only the CO could unlock it. One of the chairs was occupied by a woman having her hair set by a friend. As I worked on the sections of Joyce's straight, shiny hair, carefully following the directions on the box, I felt proud that she had asked me. But I also felt a bit more like a normal girl, performing beauty chores with girlfriends. When I accidentally sent the sink nozzle shooting out of control, spraying water everywhere, to my surprise, everyone laughed instead of cursing me out. Maybe, just a little, I was starting to fit in. In the free world, your residence can be a peaceful retreat from a long day at work. In prison, not so much. A loud discussion of farting was happening in B dorm. It had been initiated by Asia, who didn't actually live in B and was chased out. "Asia, you're out of bounds. Get your grimy ass out of here, you project hoe," someone bawled after her. I was surviving just fine in the ghetto of B dorm, due to my luck in having been paired with Natalie, and maybe to my stubborn conviction that I would be acting like a racist baby if I tried to get moved, and perhaps also to the fact that I had gone to an elite women's college. Single-sex living has certain constants, whether it's upscale or down and dirty. At Smith College, the pervasive obsession with food was expressed at candlelight dinners and at Friday afternoon faculty teas. In Danbury, it was via microwave cooking and stolen food. In many ways, I was more prepared to live in close quarters with a bunch of women than some of my fellow prisoners, who were driven crazy by communal female living. There was less bulimia and more fights than I had known as an undergrad, but the same feminine ethos was present. Empathetic camaraderie and bawdy humor on good days, and histrionic dramas coupled with meddling, malicious gossip on bad days. It was a weird place, the all-female society with a handful of strange men, the military-style living, the predominant ghetto vibe, both urban and rural, through a female lens, the mix of every age, from silly young girls to old grandmas, all thrown together with varying levels of tolerance. Crazy concentrations of people inspire crazy behavior. I can just now step back far enough to appreciate its surreal singularity. But to be back with Larry in New York, I would have walked across broken glass barefoot in a snowstorm all the way home. Mr. Butorsky, my counselor, had a policy he had come up with all by himself. Once a week he would put every prisoner he supervised, half the camp, on the call-out for a 1-minute appointment with him. You had to report to the office he shared with Torricella and sign a big logbook to acknowledge you had been there. "Anything going on?" he would ask. That was your chance to ask questions, spill your guts, or complain. I only asked questions, usually to have a visitor approved. Sometimes he was feeling curious. "How are you doing, Kerman?" I was fine. "Everything going all right with Miss Malcolm?" Yes, she was great. "She's a nice lady. Never gives me any problems. Not like some of her kind." Mr. Butorsky, it's a big adjustment for someone like you, Kerman. but you seem to be handling it. Is there anything else, Mr. Butorsky? 'Cause if not, I'm going to go... Or chatty. I'm almost done here, Kerman. Almost 20 years I've been at this. Things have changed. People at the top have different ideas about how to do things. Of course, they have no idea what really goes on here with these people. Well, Mr. Butorsky, I'm sure you'll enjoy retirement. Yeah, I'm thinking of someplace like Wisconsin, where there's more of us Northerners, if you know what I mean. Minetta, the town driver who had brought me up to camp on my first day, was due to be released in April. As her date was nearing, the line of succession was the hot topic around camp, as the town driver was the one prisoner who was allowed off the plantation on a daily basis. She was responsible for doing errands for the prison staff in town, ferrying inmates and their CO escorts to hospital appointments, and driving prisoners to the bus station after they had been released, plus any other mission that was handed to her. Never, ever had a town driver been chosen who was not a Northerner. One day, I went into the counselor's office for my call-out minute. As I was signing the book, Mr. Butorsky stared at me. Kerman, how about applying for the town driver position? Minetta is leaving soon. We need someone responsible for that job. It's an important job. Let me think about it, Mr. Butorsky? Sure, Kerman. You go right ahead and think about it. On the one hand, being the town driver would mean the opportunity to rendezvous with Larry in gas station bathrooms in the outside world. On the other hand, the town driver was widely held to be the designated camp snitch. I was no snitch, no way. And clearly no good could come from coziness with prison staff, which the town driver position required. The uncomfortable privilege and collaborator subtext was more than I could stomach. Plus, after my screwdriver misadventure, I didn't have the stomach for illicit activities, even assignations, no matter how much I lusted for Larry. The next week in Butorsky's office, I quietly turned the job down, much to his surprise. When I first arrived at the camp, Pop, the ruler of the kitchen, would watch the prison-screened movie of the week, flanked by Minetta and Nina, Pop's bunkie. They would sit in a prime spot in the back of the room and kibitz and enjoy contraband delicacies, courtesy of Pop. When Minetta left for the halfway house, her movie seat was briefly taken by a tall, imposing, and largely silent white girl who was a prolific crocheter and was also leaving soon. Nina was also preparing to depart, but she was going down the hill to a 9-month residential drug program. It was for prisoners with documented drug and alcohol addictions, who had been fortunate enough to be flagged for the program by their sentencing judge. It was the only serious rehabilitative program at Danbury, other than the puppies, and it is currently the only way in the federal system to significantly reduce your sentence. Campers headed to the drug program were always scared, as it took place not in the camp, but in the real prison, high security, locked down, and 1,200 women serving serious time, some with life sentences. Nina had the added concern of finding an acceptable replacement for herself at Pop's side. After my initial faux pas in the dining room, it didn't even occur to me that I was a candidate. But one Saturday night in the common room, Nina beckoned to me. She and the quiet girl were sitting with Pop. "Piper, come have some food." Contraband food was irresistible. One did not readily pass up the simple novelty of eating something other than institutional food, cooked with a measure of love. I was pretty damn shy, though, after Pop's veiled threat in the chow hall. They had guacamole and chips. I knew the avocados had been purchased from the commissary and were not really contraband. I took a little bite, but didn't want to seem greedy. "It's so good, thank you." Pop was looking at me sidelong. "Go on, have some more," Nina said. "I'm okay. I'm kind of full, but thank you." I started to edge away. "Come on, Piper. Sit down for a minute." Now I was nervous, but I trusted Nina. I pulled up an extra chair and perched on it, ready to flee at any sign of Pop's displeasure. I made small talk about the other woman's imminent return to the outside world, how great it would be for her to be reunited with her teenage son, and whether she would find work with the Carpenters' Union. When the movie started, I excused myself. They made the same advance the next week. That night they offered me burgers, fat and juicy compared to the ones in the dining hall. I wolfed one down without prodding, tasting oregano and thyme. Pop seemed entertained by my relish and leaned over to confide, "I use extra spices." A day or two later, Nina posed a question to me. "What do you think about watching the movie with Pop when I go to the drug program?" she asked. "What?" "She needs someone to keep her company when I leave, and get her ice and soda for her, you know?" Did Pop really want my company? "Well, you're not a wacko, you know? That's why we're friends, 'cause I can really talk to you about things." The invitation seemed like the ultimate endorsement, and not one to be turned down lightly. When I saw Pop, I tried to be charming, and perhaps I was somewhat successful. The non-wacko contingent must have been thin on the ground at that time in the camp, because a week or so later, Nina asked me if I wanted to take her place as Pop's bunkie in A dorm, the suburbs. I was perplexed. "But I'm already in B dorm. I can't move." Nina rolled her eyes. "Piper, Pop gets whatever bunkie she wants." I was stunned by this revelation that a prisoner could get what she wanted. Of course, if that inmate is the prime reason that your institutional kitchen runs in an orderly fashion— "You mean they'll move me?" More eye-rolling. I frowned, lost between contradictory impulses. B-dorm was certainly living up to its ghetto moniker, with all the irritants of any ghetto. One B-dorm practice alone drove me to the tooth-grinding brink of sanity. People would hang their little headphones on the metal bunks and blast their pocket radios through the makeshift speakers, foisting their staticky music on everyone at top tinny volume. It wasn't the music I objected to, it was the terrible audio quality. But A-dorm seemed populated by a disproportionate number of fussy old ladies, plus the puppy program dogs and their people, who were mostly nuts. And I didn't want anyone to think I was a racist, although nobody else in the camp seemed to have the slightest compunction about expressing the broadest racial generalizations. "Honey," another prisoner drawled to me, "everyone here is just trying to live up to the worst cultural stereotype possible." In fact, that was part of the motivation of this new invitation. "Pop don't want any lesbians in there," said matter-of-fact Nina, "and you're a nice white girl." On the one hand, Pop would certainly be an advantageous bunkie, as she clearly wielded a lot of influence in the camp. On the other hand, I had a strong suspicion that she would be a high-maintenance cube-mate. Look at the hustle Nina was putting on for her. Finally, I thought about Natalie. How kind she had been to me, and how easy she was to live with. And she was just 9 months from going home. If I bailed on her, who knew what kind of kook they would stick in Cube 18? "Nina, I don't think I can just ditch Miss Natalie," I said. "She has been really good to me. I hope Pop understands." Nina looked surprised. "Well, help me think about who else we can get. What about Tony? She's Italian." I said that sounded grand. They would be a perfect fit, and retreated to B-dorm, my ghetto home. Chapter 7. The Hours. There were a host of religious opportunities at Danbury. A Friday Mass for Catholics, and sometimes a Sunday Mass as well, usually delivered by the hot priest, a young padre who played guitar and spoke Italian, and was thus adored by all the Italian-Americans. A Spanish Christian service on the weekends, a Buddhist meditation group, and also rabbinical visits on Wednesdays, and a wacky weekly non-denominational be-in led by volunteers armed with acoustic guitars and scented candles. The biggie, though, was the Christian, aka fundamentalist, service held in the visiting room on Sunday evenings after visiting hours were over. In March, I asked Sister Rafferty, the German nun who was the head chaplain, whether there would be any provision for Episcopalians on Easter Sunday. She looked at me as if I had 3 heads, then replied that if I wanted to hunt down my own minister and put him or her on my full visitors list, then we could use the chapel. Thanks for nothing, sister. I found the religious prostrations of my saber-rattling born-again neighbors tedious. Some of the faithful had a distinct aspect of roostering, loudly proclaiming that they were going to pray on any number of topics: how God was walking beside them through their incarceration, how Jesus loved sinners, and so on. Personally, I thought that one could thank the Lord at a lower volume, and perhaps with less self-congratulation. You could worship loudly and still act pretty lousy, abundant evidence of which was running around the dorms. There were no new spring hats or dresses in prison, but the week before Easter, someone erected a creepy giant wooden cross behind the camp, right outside the dining hall. I was confronted with it at breakfast, and could only ask, "What the fuck?" of Mrs. Jones, the gruff old queen of the puppy program, and one of the old ladies who always came to breakfast. I was surprised to learn that she was only 55. Prison will age a gal prematurely. "They always put it up," she reported. "Some clown from CMS came up and did it." A few days later, Nina and I were discussing the impending holidays over a cup of instant coffee. Levy and the one other Jew in residence, the decidedly more likable Gail Greenman, had been given boxes of matzah by the German nun for Passover. This excited the interest of the other prisoners. "How come they get them big crackers?" a neighbor from B-dorm asked me, probing the mysteries of faith. "Them crackers would be good with jelly." Nina, her bangs in rollers, tilted her head as she reminisced about Passovers past. "One year I was in Rikers. Matzah was the only edible thing they gave us," she mused, rolling her cigarette thoughtfully between her fingers. "It's delicious with butter." This year I would not be ferrying back and forth between Larry's family Seder and my own Easter traditions. Too bad. I loved the 10 plagues. Pop and her crew pulled out all the stops for Easter dinner. It was positively lavish, a spring miracle. The menu? Baked chicken and cabbage with astonishing dumplings, so dense you could have used them as weapons, mustardy deviled eggs, and real vegetables on the salad bar. For dessert, we had Natalie's very special bird's nest confection, a deep-fried tortilla cupping a mound of pudding covered with lush green-dyed coconut grass strewn with jelly bean eggs, and a gaily colored marshmallow peep perched on top. I just stared at it, unable to believe my eyes, while everyone around me ate enthusiastically. I didn't want to eat this incredible diorama. I wanted to shellac it and save it forever. Right after Easter, Nina left to go down the hill to the high-security prison for the drug program. I would miss her. She had been knitting a scarf for weeks and weeks, and I had been consulting on it. "What color do you think now?" she would say, pulling out a remarkable collection of little scraps of yarn she had scavenged. "Purple," I would point. "Green." The whole camp was in the process of readying the 8 women who were entering the strict 9-month drug program. This process included purging any contraband they might have, acquiring new stuff at commissary, and loading them up with snacks and messages to carry to women who were doing time down the hill. It was a bit like sending them off to a scary summer camp. Nina would be just a few hundred yards away behind that awful fence, but it might as well have been thousands of miles. I might never see her again. Along with the 7 other women, her duffel bag was loaded into the town driver's van, and I hugged her. "Thank you, Nina, for everything. The scarf's for you, Piper. I'm going to finish it." Pop was crying. As Nina headed down the hill to the FCI, I felt a real sense of loss. She was the first real friend I had made, and I wouldn't have any contact with her at all. Prison is so much about the people who are missing from your life and who fill your imagination. Some of the missing were just across the prison grounds. I knew a half-dozen women who had sisters or cousins down the hill in the high-security prison. One day, while walking back to work after lunch, I glimpsed Nina through the back gate of the FCI and went crazy, jumping up and down and waving. She saw me and waved too. The truck that patrolled the prison perimeter screeched to a halt between us. "Cut that shit out!" came sharply from the guard inside. Pop, who had spent many years down on the compound before being moved up to the camp, had enlisted multiple messengers to deliver treats to her friends still behind the wire. Living in A-dorm, the suburbs, Pop had an enormous locker in her cube, twice the size of mine and Natalie's. It was crammed with a bounty of her favorite things, food items like Spam that were no longer available on commissary, clothing from long ago that no one else had, and most important, perfume. She liked to mix her own, a little white diamonds, a little opium. Ode to Pop. "I'm almost done," said Pop, as she selected a few precious contraband lace brassieres to send to a friend doing life down the hill. "What am I hanging on to these for? I go home in January. I'll get pretty new bras for my jewels." Pop was a source of wonder and mystery and revelation. I didn't know it at the time, but Nina had set me up with a woman who would help me do my time in every sense of the word, who would baby me when I needed it most, and tell me to suck it up and get tough when there was no other option. She had cast a skeptical eye over me at first, but when I procured a wooden board from the CMS shop to put under her mattress for back support, her opinion of me improved significantly. My ability to write her furlough requests was also useful, but it was my voracious appetite for her cooking and her stories that won her over. Pop had lived a crazy life on the outside, arriving in this country from Russia at the age of 3. She was married out of her parents' house at 18 to a Russian gangster. Their life together had included all the excessive disco splendor of New York in the 1970s and 1980s, and several years on the run from the feds. The feds tried to nail us every which way. My husband would just laugh. "Well, if they wanted you bad enough, they're gonna get you. They don't ever give up." Her husband was in prison somewhere down south, and her children were grown now. She had lost everything, yet managed to take a dozen years in prison and hold it all together and make the best of it. Pop was cunning and exuberant. She was kind, but she could be ruthless. She knew how to work the system, and also how not to let them break you. And they were always trying. Pop's grown children came to visit her every week, along with several other family members, murmuring in Russian. The visiting room was the only place I ever saw her in regulation khaki uniform. Otherwise, she was always in her checked kitchen pants, burgundy smock with Pop embroidered on the breast in white yarn, and a hairnet. But for visits, she would always fix her hair and put on makeup, so she would look ladylike, girlish almost. Anyone who received visits on a regular basis usually maintained at least one uniform exclusively for these occasions, one that fit well, was kept pressed and stain-free, and in some instances was specially tailored. It was against prison rules to alter clothing in any way, but that never stopped anyone from trying to find ways to make the drab men's uniforms a bit more flattering, a bit more feminine. Some women would iron patterned folds into the backs of the boxy, billowy shirts. Everyone knew which inmates had sewing skills, and you could trade commissary goods for a better fit. The Spanish mommies particularly liked to wear their pants tight, tight, tight. I was thrilled when someone gave me a pair of the most desirable flat-front Dickies, which had been taken in at the waist and tapered narrow at the ankle. The inner thighs were threadbare, but my fellow prisoners clicked their tongues approvingly as I sashayed to my visits. "P.I. Piper," my neighbor Delicious shouted appreciatively. "Brick house," Larry agreed. his eyes popping when he first saw me in the tight pants. Hair was at least as important as unis. This was not an issue for a blonde, straight-haired gal like me, but for the black and Spanish women, it was the source of endless preoccupation and countless woman hours. You could generally tell who was expecting a visit by the state of their hair. There were frequent disputes about chair time in the salon room, played out against the overpowering smells of perm solution and burning hair. The electric supply for the room was insufficient for the demand, and the circuits tripped all the time. But reprehensible DeSimon refused to do anything about it. "They ought to close that so-called beauty salon down," he snarled, when the gals in the shop suggested that the electric crew might work on the wiring there. "It's not working on these convicts." Once a prisoner completed her coiffure, she could move on to makeup. Approximately a third of the population wore makeup almost every day, out of habit, as an effort to feel normal, or to be more alluring either to a staffer or another inmate. It was bought at the commissary, or in the case of one ex-stockbroker who was addicted to Borghese, smuggled in via a visitor. Before she left for the drug program, Nina gave me a little heart-shaped compact, the kind you might find at a dollar store, and I experimented with lurid eyeshadow colors. A significant percentage of the Spanish women had tattooed eyeliner, lip liner, and eyebrows, an effect I found unnerving. I associated it with meatpacking district transsexual hookers. The tattooed brows never matched the real brows, which then had to be plucked or shaved, and with time they would fade from black to blue. Almost everyone expecting a visit would present themselves pressed, coiffed, and painted on the landing next to the payphones, where you could see your loved ones approaching up the hill from the parking lot. Those who weren't expecting visits would plant themselves on the stairs anyway to observe the comings and goings as a source of vicarious entertainment. They could generally identify any regulars on sight. "Oh, there's Ginger's kids. There's Angela's parents. He always drops her mom off before he parks. She's got a bad hip." Visitors had to fill out a form stating that they had no firearms or narcotics on their person. The CO would then check the inmate's list to be sure that the visitor's name was on it. You had to hope that the list was up to date, something that was completely dependent on the inmate's counselor. Did he do his paperwork? Had he bothered to turn it in? If not, tough shit. It didn't matter who your visitor was or how far they had come to see you, they were not getting in. Larry told me how painful it was to watch every visitor, old or young, street punk or fancy yuppie, have to suck it up and kiss the prison guard's ass in the hope of culling some sort of favor. The power games that fueled so much of the prisoner guard experience extended to the visiting room. Larry came to see me every week, and I lived for those visits. They were the highlight of my life in Danbury, a chest-filling affirmation of how much I loved him. My mother drove 6 hours round trip until I begged her to come every other week. I saw more of her during the 11 months I was at Danbury than I had in all my previous adult years. Yoga Janet and Sister Platy always had a lot of visitors, aging counterculture hipsters and rosy-cheeked lefties in homespun Guatemalan cottons, respectively. Sister Platy was frustrated by the BOP's effective censorship of her visiting list. International peace figures had tried to gain permission to visit her and had been denied. Some women never got visits because they had effectively said goodbye to the outside world. No children, no parents, no friends, nobody. Some of them were halfway around the world from home, and some of them didn't have a home. Some women stated flatly that they did not want their people to see them in a place like this. In general, the longer you were down, the fewer and farther between were your visits. I worried about my bunkie, Natalie, finishing her 8-year bid. She spoke to her young son on the phone every night and received many letters, but didn't have a single visit in the year we lived together. I observed the unspoken privacy wall we erected between us in our 7 by 10 foot space, and never asked. Although each day often seemed endless, now each week came to an end before I expected it, hastened by visiting hours. I was remarkably lucky to have a visit from someone on Thursday or Friday, and also on Saturday or Sunday. This was a function of Larry and my mother's commitment, plus that of a large stock of friends in New York who were eager to come see me. Larry juggled my complex visiting schedule with cruise director aplomb. When my counselor, Butorsky, suddenly left, I feared another bureaucratic nightmare. He reportedly preferred early retirement to submitting to the will of Warden DeBoo, a much younger, non-northern female, and he was replaced with another lifer, Mr. Finn, who was also nearing the 20-year mark at the prison. Finn immediately made enemies among the camp prisoners and staff by demanding a private office and harassing the orderlies about the quality of their floor waxing. When he moved into his fancy private office, he placed a brass nameplate on the door. Of course, the damn thing disappeared immediately, which resulted in an army of COs coming in to shake down the camp. They would not rest until Officer Finn's nameplate was found. "You out of the frying pan and into the fire, Bunky," said Natalie, who knew Finn from previous years down the hill. "That man is nothing nice. At least Butorsky did his paperwork. Finn hates paperwork." This stressed me out, given the extensive visiting list juggling I was trying to perform. But my blonde hair and blue eyes stood me in good stead, just as they had with Butorsky. Mr. Finn was automatically inclined to like me, and when I approached with a new visitor's form and a timid request that maybe he would grant a special visit or shift my list around, as Mr. Butorsky had done, he snorted. "Gimme that. I don't give a shit how many people you have on your visiting list. I'll put 'em all on." "You will?" "Sure." Finn looked me up and down. "What the fuck are you doing in here? We don't see women like you much." 10-year-old drug offense, Mr. Finn." "What a waste. It's a waste for half of you people up in this camp. Most of you drug people shouldn't even be here. Not like those scumbags down the hill. There's one that killed her 2 kids. I think it's a waste to keep her alive." I didn't know how to respond to that. "So you'll put that visitor on my list, Mr. Finn?" "Sure." And he did. My visiting list grew beyond 25 rapidly. Another example of the mystifying way that no prison rule was ever really cast in stone. Larry and my mother were my lifelines to the outside world, but I was also lucky enough to have friends who came to see me. Their visits were particularly refreshing because they weren't tinged with the guilty knowledge of what I was putting Larry and my family through. I could just relax and laugh my ass off as my friends brought news and questions and observations from their miraculously normal lives. David, my San Francisco book club buddy and Larry's ex-roommate, was a visiting room regular. He lived in Brooklyn now and would schlep up to Connecticut on the train once a month. What was especially wonderful about his visits was that he acted as if everything were perfectly normal, surveying the landscape with both curiosity and acceptance. He loved the vending machines. "Let's stroll over there and get a nosh." I wanted to weep at how my friends took my calamity in stride. David excited much attention at the camp. Perhaps it was his combination of red hair, blasé charm, and arty eyeglasses that attracted so much pointed comment. Or maybe they just weren't used to gay New York Jews in that neck of the woods. "That's quite a friend you've got there," commented one of the male COs after a visit. Leered Mr. Finn, "Just pretend I feel about women the way that buddy of yours from the visiting room does." But the other prisoners loved David, who was always chatty with them. "Did you have a good time today with your faggot friend?" Pop asked after one of David's visits. Of course I had. "Faggots make the best friends," she said philosophically. "They're very loyal." My dear friend Michael wrote to me every Tuesday on his beautiful Louis Vuitton writing paper. His letters seemed like artifacts of a distant and exotic culture. On his first visit to see me, he had the misfortune of arriving at the same time as the airlift transport bus, and he was treated to the sight of disheveled women in jumpsuits entering the FCI in full shackles, supervised by guards with high-gauge rifles. When I joined him at a card table, cheerful in my tidy khaki uniform, he looked shaken but relieved. Friends also came from Pittsburgh, Wyoming, and California to visit. My best friend Kristen left her new business in Washington to come see me every month, peering worriedly at my face for signs of trouble that others might not have caught. We have been inseparable friends since the first week of college. An odd pair, to be sure. She's a fairly proper Southerner, a straight arrow, an overachiever driven to please. I, a not-so-straight arrow. But deep down, she and I are very much the same. Similar families, similar values. Simpatico. She was going through a rough time. Her marriage was ending as her company was being born. And to have a heart-to-heart talk with her best friend, she had to haul ass to a Connecticut prison. I noticed that every time Kristen came to see me, Officer Scott would materialize in the visiting room and gaze at her like a teenage boy. Once a male friend came to visit me, a tall, curly-headed lawyer. He had been consulting with a pro bono client at a nearby men's prison, so he decided to stop by on his way home. Usually, he and his wife came to see me together. On that quiet Thursday afternoon, he and I had a grand old time, talking and laughing for hours. Afterward, Pop cornered me. "I saw you in the visiting room. You looked like you were having some good time. So who is that guy? Does Larry know he's visiting you?" I tried to keep a straight face while I assured Pop that my visitor was an old college friend of Larry's, and that yes, my fiancé knew about the visit. I wondered if Larry had any idea how many fans he had behind bars. When visiting hours were over, the last inmate stragglers hugged and kissed their loved ones goodbye, and we were left together, sometimes lost in our own thoughts, hoping the CO would be lazy and skip the strip searches. If someone was crying, you smiled sympathetically or touched their shoulder. If someone was grinning, you asked, "How was your visit?" as you unlaced your shoes. Once you were finished with squatting naked and coughing, you could burst back through the double doors into the rest of the camp building, onto the landing, where there were always lots of women loitering, waiting for the phones, and watching the visitors walk down the hill to the parking lots. If you were quick, you could dart to the window and catch one last glimpse of your visitor departing. Larry only told me later, when I was safe at home, how devastating it was for him to turn back and see me waving goodbye through the glass, and then to head back down the hill, leaving me alone.